It is 9 o'clock now. Did she tell us?
Okay. Hello. Hello. You turn it on.
I knew it would.
Just use this.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Why Diversity Isn't Changing Your Newsroom Culture, Cultural Tipping Points and How to Bring About Change. We're live at the International Journalism Festival in Perugia in Italy. I'm Kay Biswas. I'm a critic who's published essays in The New Statesman, The New York Times, The Nation, Le Monde Diplomatique and The Times Literary Supplement. I'm chair of Resonance FM, which is Europe's most listened to community radio station, and On Road Media, which trains and supports people from marginalised backgrounds who've experienced things like homelessness and domestic violence, the asylum and criminal justice systems. A few years ago, I formed the Race Beat, which is a network led by and for journalists of colour working in Britain, and I'm the editor of Representology, the Journal for Media and Diversity. Now, I'm delighted to welcome a first-class panel. Panel, would you like to introduce yourself? From Joseph.
Hi everyone, and thanks for coming along this morning. I'm Joseph Harker. I'm the Guardian's senior editor for diversity and development, and before that, for several years, I was the deputy opinion editor.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Eva Simpson. I am delighted to be here, and thank you for so many of you for joining us this morning. I am an opinion columnist at the Daily Mirror newspaper, and previous to that, I've worked at many newspapers across Fleet Street. I was a news editor on The Times, a showbiz columnist on The Mirror, and I was also the Los Angeles correspondent for The Sun.
Good morning. I'm Marcus Ryder. Thank you very much, everyone, for getting up so early. So I really appreciate that. I'm the head of external consultancies at the Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity, which was set up about 2 years ago. Previous to that, I worked at the BBC for 24 years, and in the last 8 years, I was head of current affairs programming for BBC Scotland. So I oversaw the Scottish referendum coverage as well, and I've worked in China and Malaysia.
Thank you, panel. We will have time for questions at the end, but because of COVID rules, we can't make use of a roving mic. So please tweet your questions to me at BizK1. That's at BIZK1. Now, Diane Kemp, who's the director of the Lenny Henry Centre, was meant to chair today, but sadly is back in England convalescing from COVID. She sends everyone her best. Her colleague, Marcus Ryder, is here and will give us a brief overview into diversity tipping points and cultural change.
Okay. Very briefly, the Selena Henry Centre for Media Diversity is based at Birmingham City University. We try and combine the best of academic work on diversity and practitioners who have experience of diversity. We've done consultancy work for all the major public service broadcasters in Britain. That's BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, and Sky. We are currently working with the FT, and I've personally done private consultancy work for The Guardian, News UK, and Beck2, which is the UK's largest media trade union. One of the issues we are increasingly looking at is the fact that increasing diversity headcount, i.e. employing more black people or more Asian people, more disabled people, etc., doesn't seem to translate to a change in a media organisation's culture and possibly more importantly in the type of journalism or programmes they produce. And ultimately, we believe that is what we should be aiming for, a change in culture and output to better reflect the views and values and perspectives of the country a media organisation is based. Otherwise, what is the point in trying to increase diversity? So first, the good news. Old psychological and economic theories thought you needed a majority, i.e. 51% of an organisation to think in a certain way to change the views and values of an organisation, to change that culture. That's been pushed back against by more recent academic work, and a study published in Science in 2018 demonstrated that it can be changed, culture can be changed by as little as 20% of your organisation thinking in a certain way. Although 20% is the minimum, you probably need, according to that report, and other reports, somewhere between 25 and 30%. So this explains partly what is going on. That means you can increase your levels of diversity, increase the number of disabled people, increase the number of black and brown people. You can double it to like 19%, depending on your starting point, and 20% is a big number, right? And yet you see no discernible impact. So it can be very frustrating for managers and people that are trying to change an organization's culture, and for news editors as well. So what we're doing at the Lenny Henry Centre is advising media organizations where to focus your 20 to 30%, right, to achieve real change. So you're not looking to try and achieve that throughout the entire organization, or you are, but you might not be able to. So if you want culture change, what are the parts of your organization that drive that culture? And when you can identify those, you might want to focus your efforts on that, right? The other thing that the centre does is that we try and bust myths and commonly misheld perceptions about diversity, and supported by academic literature. And one of those, again, is the idea that all you need to do is change a few gatekeepers, change a few execs, and then everything will be solved. This doesn't hold up to academic scrutiny, right? In a seminal paper titled "Female Tokens in High Prestige Work Groups, Catalysts or Inhibitors of Group Diversification," not a catchy title, but really good paper, right? They found that when male managers promoted diversity, so when men promoted diversity, they received slightly higher performance ratings and were perceived as, quote unquote, good guys, creating a better workplace. However, when women executives promoted diversity, they were perceived as nepotistic, trying to, quote, advance their own group. And their own performance was then negatively perceived accordingly. This can have a perverse result. This can mean that paradoxically, simply appointing a few quote-unquote diverse execs or people from diverse backgrounds can actually slow down diversity efforts, right? Because what can happen is that white men on boards who had previously advocated for diversity when there were no women or no people of color present, when you finally get one diverse person on the board, high up, they, for very logical reasons, they often don't want to promote diversity. It is harmful to their own careers, right? This in turn means that the men who might have previously promoted diversity, they take their cultural lead from the one-woman executive, so then they don't promote diversity, and so a lot of the studies actually show that diversity is then slowed down if you only promote one gatekeeper, right? One woman, one person of color, right? That can actually have a detrimental effect. In a British context, we call that the Thatcher Effect, right? But it's, we see it time and time again. That doesn't mean there aren't ways around it, and part of the work of the centre is to look at these academic studies, and instead of getting dismayed, we then work with practitioners like Joseph, like Eva, like Biz, to then see how we can then marry that with the academic work, with their working experience, to come with real solutions, rather than just get all depressed and think, oh my goodness, nothing's going to change. Right? So that's why we've created this panel, so we can then hear solutions from the practitioners themselves, and then I can sprinkle in a few of the academia.
Thanks, Marcus. That was genuinely fascinating. So let me set the scene briefly. as I'm speaking in a personal capacity, I can speak rather freely. I think in terms of diversity, traditional media in Britain has a historically poor record. Newspapers and broadcasters for decades have recruited from narrow socio-economic pools, their journalism frequently charged with an over-reliance on nepotism and patronage and an old boys network showing little desire to reflect modern Britain. Vast social groups are woefully underrepresented. Out of every 20 journalists working in the UK, only one is a person of colour, and they invariably find themselves in junior positions or on precarious contracts. Only an exceptional few get to break in and have autonomy in their work, and I'm delighted to be joined by 3 of them this morning. I want to begin with the experiences of journalists of colour in newspapers. Joseph, from the late 80s, you started in black media before taking on staff roles at The Guardian. Can you tell us a bit about that journey?
Yeah, well, Biz, thanks very much, Biz, but first you were very nice. I thought you said describe the media's track record on diversity as poor. It's absolutely appalling. I mean, it's way worse than poor. I started out, I got my first break at The Voice newspaper, which is a black British newspaper, which had been set up in 1982, and I joined it in 1987, so it was still very much expanding, and it was a way to get in. And were it not for The Voice and the black media, I would probably never have made it as a journalist. I would have never made that first step. I was in the black press for 5 years altogether before coming to The Guardian. I came to The Guardian through a route which was kind of typical at the time. I just happened to make contact with The Guardian when they were doing a reporting assignment in South Africa at the same time that I was doing an assignment in South Africa for The Voice. And I made contacts then, stayed in touch, and then when I left the black press, I approached The Guardian, and they took me on for 2 weeks, and I'm still there. That was in 1992. And but it was a typical route that there was no process, there were no jobs advertised, there was no route in. If you weren't part of that clique of white, middle class, mostly home counties, Oxbridge graduates, and at the time mostly male, although in the 90s things started to change on that front. So there was no way that people were from outside that clique could actually even find out about jobs. You couldn't come into from another national newspaper because all the national newspapers were the same. And it wasn't until 1999 with the Macpherson inquiry, which some of you may have heard of. A young teenager, Stephen Lawrence, was murdered in 1993, and the police, even though they were well aware of the key suspects for his murderers, they never bothered to investigate. There was a major national inquiry into it, which released its findings in 1999 and sparked a massive debate about race and racism in Britain. It's basically Britain's equivalent of the George Floyd moment, happened in 1999. And it was a moment when at The Guardian I could say, what are we doing here? We're talking about this concept of institutional racism. How can we not accept that we as an institution have the same issues here? And it was a moment where I could start pushing on the whole diversity agenda, saying we need to open our doors to more people of colour. And we started advertising jobs. We didn't get much change. The change didn't seem to happen much because it was the people who were close to the people at The Guardian were the people who were getting the jobs. So then I started a scheme called the Positive Action Scheme, which we specifically targeted at black and Asian aspiring journalists in order to give them experience of a national newspaper and at the same time to give the editors inside the newspaper an idea of the talent that they were missing out on. And we started in 2002 with about half a dozen people, and we've gone on and over the years hundreds of people have come through the scheme. Many of them have come either to work at The Guardian, to freelance at The Guardian, or to have other careers in journalism. But it's just opening the doors and advertising externally. Advertising won't do it on its own. It's a very long process. There are also quick wins you can have, but overall change and from having in the in 1999 about 10 people of colour at The Guardian. We've now got 60, 70, 80, probably around that number. So we have made quite a significant change. We're still not anywhere near where we need to be, but we are getting there, and we have people of colour in senior positions now at The Guardian. And I'd still say The Guardian is unlike any other newspaper. We are way ahead on this issue, way ahead of all the rest of the national newspapers. So we've still got a long way to go. I would never claim otherwise, but we are heading in the right direction.
Thank you, Joseph. Now, at the start of the 21st century, Eva, you joined the leading British tabloid, the Daily Mirror. Can you tell us about that?
Sorry, I was talking to the lady about my microphones.
So, at the start of the 21st century, you joined the leading British tabloid, the Daily Mirror. Can you tell us a bit about your early experiences there? Yeah,
no, absolutely. So thank you. So I suppose my big break in national newspapers came on the Daily Mirror in the early 2000s, and I joined the Mirror. It was a new showbiz column which the then editor Piers Morgan, some of you may have heard of him, decided to put together. Now, our predecessor was a guy called Matthew Wright, and he was a middle-aged white guy who would run the showbiz column. Should I use that? Is it on? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Sorry, guys. So sorry. I'll start that all again. So we were talking about my big break. So my big break came in the early 2000s when I was recruited to join the Daily Mirror as a showbiz columnist. And we were recruited by Piers Morgan, who was the editor of the Daily Mirror. And I think this was a really early example of diversity in action before diversity was a thing. So before I joined the column, our predecessor was a guy called Matthew Wright. He was a sort of middle-aged white guy who was going around writing about pop stars and showbiz. And Piers, in his brilliance, I guess, he just wanted a different type. He just wanted a different type of journalism. So he recruited myself and 2 other young women journalists to go around, sort of, go to all these showbiz parties and write about celebrity. And I think it probably was the first time that diversity had been baked into an actual recruitment. But it was really positive and it was really successful because we quickly became the #1 showbiz column. And I think another reason why we were very successful was because we all had different interests and different backgrounds. So Jessica, who was my colleague, was interested in theatre and the arts and highbrow stuff. I had my sensibilities in R&B and hip hop and black music, if you would say, and Polly was into pop music. So we could all write about different things, and so I think it was an early example of, if you have a diverse team, how you can bring different interests and different sensibilities, and in turn you then bring on different audiences because you're appealing to different audiences. And so I think it was it was very progressive of the Mirror to do that. I think fast forward now to where we are in 2022, would that happen? Would we replicate that same spirit and bring together people from different backgrounds? I think not. I think actually we've probably gone backwards in that sort of, as we talk more about diversity, but I think we don't practice it as much as we like to think we do.
Thanks, Eva. And in terms of the world of British broadcasting, Marcus, you've spent many years working with broadcasters, including the BBC. What were the key challenges? Who were your role models? Did anything change within these labyrinthine institutions?
I think it's important to recognise that the broadcast industry and the media industry as a whole is part of a larger ecosystem. It makes up a large ecosystem. So I think what can sometimes happen is that we get lost in one particular organisation, whether that's The Guardian or whether it happens to be just one example of best practice at the Mirror. And as Joseph was saying, The Guardian might have, or there might be a really good example of best practice, but most people work their careers by working for the BBC, then working for Channel 4, working for Indies. In newspapers, you're working for The Guardian, then you might go to the Sun, might go to the Times, you then might go to the Mirror, as we all have. And so, if one part of that chain is broken, then that can derail people's careers, irrespective of how good one thing is. So it's trying to find out how we can actually work together so that people can actually form careers. So what you invariably find is people at the BBC, people of colour at the BBC, disabled people at the BBC, they do relatively well, but they hit glass ceilings. And where those glass ceilings might be hit by everybody, what happens is that those people then leave the BBC, do quite well in the indie, then they come back into the BBC or then go back into another broadcaster, for example. What invariably happens is that people can hit glass ceilings at the BBC or Channel 4, they leave the broadcaster, and then their careers go nowhere, and then and so you don't get the people at the high levels, and then you don't change that culture, and I think fundamentally what we're trying to do is change the culture. We're not just trying to get more people that think like us, that think like white people, but happen to have a bit more melanin. We're not trying to just simply the inspiration I take from, when you ask who my inspirations, in many ways, I was talking to Eva last night, and Eva was definitely an inspiration. And the reason why she was an inspiration for me was because she was doing entertainment journalism, which is something I didn't really want to do, right? But then I saw she moved to be editor, and she had quite a high profile, so her picture was always on the newspaper, and it was kind of like, this was a long time ago, so forgive me if I get this slightly wrong, but I'd open up the newspaper and it'd be, Eva has gone to this club and is talking about this bit of gossip of this celebrity or whatever, and I'd be like, okay, that's quite interesting. But then what was fascinating was Eva then went to be, was it deputy editor?
Of the London paper.
Of the London paper, right? And it's that transition to having real editorial power so that you can actually shape the culture of your news organisation, which I thought at that point, when did you do that?
That was about 2010.
Yeah, so at that point, that's when I actually started to properly pay attention to what you were doing. Yeah. So I'd be really curious as to what that transition was like, having that power from previously. Sorry, I know you're chairing, so I'm curious.
I think that's a good point.
Yeah,
So
no, it's a good question. I think what I would say is that you're right. I think often in journalism, especially when you're a journalist of colour, when you're a black journalist, you do hit that glass ceiling. And I think that what happens in media is that you often, it's like a herd. There's always, there's this bit of a herd mentality. And then editors or news editors decide who they like, who they think is, culturally the right fit for an organisation. And so often, unless you do have someone who's a bit of a cheerleader and who champions you and thinks, okay, I think there's something about you I like and I want to help you progress, I think without those cheerleaders and without people championing you, you can hit that glass ceiling. I think I was very lucky in my career that I always had editors or people who saw something in me and wanted me to progress. And so when I when I was at the Mirror and I was doing showbiz journalism, I had a baby, and so it was quite hard to be going out to, nightclubs or the Brit Awards till 4 o'clock in the morning because I had a young baby. I felt I had hit a bit of a glass ceiling and I didn't know where I could necessarily go. But then I had a former colleague who said, look, I've just joined this new free newspaper. It was a new phenomenon at the time. We know that you can manage people, you can manage teams. We know that you have a good news sense. Why don't you come and make this transition? That was a bit of a leap for me. I'd never been a newspaper exec. I'd never managed a huge newsroom. But it was just someone who had faith in me. And I think often it is ultimately about your networks and about people you know and who want to see you progress. And I think often in organisations, when you're maybe the only black person or the only person from an Asian background, you don't have those networks, you don't have those people to push you, and often you don't know how to navigate. I think getting through newsrooms, newspapers, or broadcasters, it's all about how you navigate. And I think no one ever teaches you that, no one tells you that. And so if you find out quite late in the game, then it becomes a bit harder. So I always say to people, look, it's a game, it's a long process, and you've got to think about where you want to end up. No one really in newsrooms is sitting around going, oh, I want to promote you, I want to make things better for you.
I'm not so... I would challenge that last bit, though, because I remember a very senior executive saying, you can push yourself up but so far, but eventually somebody needs to pull you up.
Yeah.
All right? And so when you say there's nobody saying, oh, I'm going to promote you, there are champions, and they are championing non-diverse people more. I always think diversity is a choice. You know, we can employ more black people, we can employ more disabled people, and we can also choose not to employ more black people and not to employ more women.
Well, Joseph, so you've been a long-standing editor. How do these conversations around diversity affect a newsroom's culture? I mean, you must have seen lots of people come to the doors of The Guardian.
Yeah, and I just think on the issue of champions, and champions are obviously great, but I think we need to be aware of them, because often it'll be a white male person will choose one person who's a diverse background and think, yes, I'm going to put them in a position, and then that will be it. And then they'll sit back and think, well, I've done my work now, I've got that one person, and sometimes that person will be used in a prominent role and then make the champion feel good about themselves. But it doesn't necessarily mean, what's more important is that we actually have a structure which brings more people through, rather than people just being dependent on one individual champion among a number of editors within an organisation, the rest of whom may not care about diversity. So you need to have a proper structure in place which brings through people, which encourages people. And in terms of newsroom diversity, I mentioned that we had this George Floyd moment in 1999. What I found sort of most disheartening about the Black Lives Matter period 2 years ago, well, not that it's over, but that particular summer, was that we seem to be having the same conversations as we'd had 20 years ago. People saying, well, we need to get out into universities to find black staff, and we really need to be thinking about this and trying to encourage people and bring them through. These conversations happened 20 years ago, and what happened in the aftermath of them was often a few people of colour would come into an organisation, they would be like a fish out of water. It's this idea of diversity but without inclusion. That if you only have diversity, if you only have brown faces, and the organisation doesn't change to encourage them, to show them that they're valued, then they will wither, they will be disheartened, they will have as a journalist, you're used to having your ideas rejected. That's part of the job. But if you're new to an organisation and you see all the senior people are white, and you're not, or you're a different background, you're working class, you're a woman, you're gay, whatever, and you find your ideas being rejected, it's not that long before you start wondering, is that just because they don't like me and my ideas, or people like me, or they're not interested in ideas from people like me? And before you know it, you start to think, well, actually, I'm not, you're assuming that your ideas are going to be rejected before you even come up with them. You need to, editors, if you are going to take on people with difference, you need to let those people know that you want their difference. There's that Whitney Houston movie, Can I Be Me? And if a person with a different background approaches an editor and says, can I be me? Can an editor give them the honest answer, yes? Or is the answer, well, maybe, but we'd rather you were like this instead? And I think that's a fundamental question.
I think that depends, Joseph. I mean, what I would say to you, I would challenge that. I've never worked at a newspaper where I haven't felt I could be me. I've always felt that I could be my authentic self, and I could always lean into the things and the issues and the stories that I wanted to lean into. If I was pushing stories, at the end of the day, your newspaper has an agenda, so you can't just go off and do whatever you want to do. But yes, you should be able to bring stories to your news editor. You should be, and if your stories are I've felt that I could bring stories, if they were getting rejected, I could push back. So I think what I would say is that as a woman of colour, I've always felt empowered to lean into those things, not to lean out of those things. Newsrooms have their own culture. So when I joined the Daily Mirror, I was, a young journalist from South London. I wasn't part of that male culture of going to the pub, of going to get pints, and all that. That was part of the culture. I quickly cottoned on to the fact that that's where stuff happened. that's where you got to meet editors and news editors, and they got to you got that FaceTime. So I cottoned on to the fact that this is the culture of this organisation, and if I want to sort of navigate and move forward, I'm going to have to go to the pub after work and go to meet. Now, obviously, if I was from a Muslim background, how would I navigate that, having to go to an environment where there's alcohol? So I get that there are issues, but it's about navigating and also leaning into your authentic self, and that has not been my experience.
I have to come back on you on that, Eva.
That has not been my experience.
Because, as you said, Eva, you were brought in by the editor, Piers Morgan, in a really high-profile column. You were one of the 3 a.m.
But
girls.
I wasn't plucked from anywhere. I had already spent 5 years as a
but
journalist.
you came into the Daily Mirror as a 3 a.m. girl with a high-profile column. For most people of colour, we don't come in at that level. We don't come in with the backing of the editor, with the kind of... We have to make our way up. In an organisation, we're treated as that anonymous brown person in the corner, and so that's when I say that the organisations need to include and value. You were brought in a position where you're immediately valued because you were a 3 a.m. girl, and that gave you an access to the editor, which is not. So I'm talking about what is the experience of most people of colour in national newspapers, most people from different non-traditional backgrounds in national newspapers.
So, we have different experiences from the panellists. If you've got questions, a quick reminder, please tweet me at BizK1, that's BIZK1, and I will ask the panellists the questions towards the end. Now, for the second half of the panel, we can focus on solutions, I'm hoping. So, Marcus, what does the industry need to do better to improve diversity?
So what we advise, going back to there's a few things that you can do as a media organisation. One of the things we advise is that look at that 20%, 25% tipping point issue if you want to change your culture. So a really nice example that I pick is Harvey Weinstein investigation with regards to the New York Times. And so with that story, the New York Times at that point did not have 50-50 parity, gender parity. But what it did have, in the investigations unit, the head of the investigations unit was a woman who was not placed there on a diversity. She was there because she was great at investigations. The lead investigator on the story was a woman. Her second, so they had 2 journalists on the story, was a woman. And not the lead lawyer, but the second lawyer was a woman. So you had 4 women, not brought in to do gender investigations, but brought in just to do investigations in key positions, that actually shape the culture. The investigations unit is really important for original journalism and shaping the culture of the New York Times. So they didn't need, when I say they didn't need, of course they need 50-50 parity, But in order to change the culture of the New York Times, you didn't need 50-50 parity at that point. What you needed was to ensure that you had your diversity in key positions in your news organization. Because other newspapers and other media organizations had chased the Harvey Weinstein investigation and had failed. And so I don't think it's a coincidence. And the other newspaper or the other media organization was Ronan Farrow, and I also don't think it's who also broke it roughly about the same kind of time. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that Ronan is LGBTQ, I think is non-binary, but also identifies as coming from a diverse background as well, But with the New York Times, you had this key critical mass. And so it's trying to find out where do you want to place your key critical masses. So that's the advice that we give. The other advice that we give is that media organizations are constantly looking at their diversity headcount. And so the work that we did with The Guardian, we advised them to put in a different metric. Because if you do diversity headcounts, then often it can be you can reach whatever your target is, your 15% target, your 20% target, your 50% target, in low positions, in your researchers, or in parts of your organization which which don't shape the culture, right? And so we advise that as well as looking at your headcount diversity, you should also set a target of percentage of salary spend, right? Salary is invariably a proxy for power, right, in an organization, so you really see where the power lies in an organization. So if you're going to set a 20% headcount diversity for people of color, if you're going to set 15% for disability, we also advise you to set a 15% salary spend, because that's really where the power dynamic is. And then when you're talking about power, then you're starting to talk about culture change. And so change your metrics, see where you're focusing. Those are two, if you take away nothing else from the advice that the Centre often gives people, those are the two key messages that I want to get across.
Brilliant. So, in practical terms, Joseph, how can you push a media organisation from talking about diversity to meaningful structural change?
Well, I have a handy 6-point plan, which I think might answer your very question. Here's one I prepared earlier.
Did The Guardian know about this handy 6-point plan, Joseph?
I'm working through it. But I think for any organisation, if you want diversity, I think the first question you need to ask yourself is, why do you want it? Are you there because you actually want diversity? Are you there because it's a good word like world peace or whatever, something that we all kind of vaguely like the idea of, but it's always going to be not really a priority, we'll shove it down the line somewhere? The first thing is realise, why do you want it? And if you don't want it for genuine reasons, then give up there and stop fooling yourself. Just forget it. I think that the next thing has to be decide if you want to change. It's that point I made earlier about valuing your staff. There's a great quote that Angela Davis gave to my former Guardian colleague, Gary Young. And she said, diversity, she said, it's the change that brings no change, the difference that makes no difference. It's like replacing white faces with brown faces doing exactly the same thing will not change your organisation. If you want to be a proper functioning, properly diverse, functional, inclusive organisation, you have to accept that you need to change. You need to change what you value. It has to be away from the sort of, might be high, opera, ballet loving, whatever, Oxbridge educated type value system, to a broader working class, female, people of colour, disability inclusive environment. That's what you actually, and you need to change your workplace in order to include people of difference. The third thing I'd say is you need to have the person at the top of your organisation needs to be absolutely on board with this. If that's not the case, forget it. I spent a long time arguing with people about why we needed to do diversity and change things, and they would be thinking, well, what does my boss want? And if they think their boss just wants them to do the same old thing, then unless the boss makes it absolutely clear that he or she wants change, then the middle managers are going to keep doing things exactly as they always have done. Fourth thing I say is don't expect quick results. I was mentioning the positive action scheme. Sometimes, we'd love to have more people with disability at The Guardian. There's not a system we have in place to get people with differently abled people into journalism. So we need to think the long term in that regard. I set up 10 years ago a positive action scheme. We expanded it for people with disability, but it's not a major funnel at the moment, but we need to work on that. Similarly, the positive action scheme has been going 20 years now. One of the people who was on the scheme in the very first year is now our features editor. So you can see how progress comes over time. But so you just need to be in it for the long term. I think sometimes in terms of gender has been something which people have been able to make quick results on, because male editors know women, they have daughters, they have friends who are women, they're female, and so making change on gender was relatively quick and relatively easy. Not that gender is an issue which has been sorted by any means, but there were lots of quick wins there, but you can't expect the same for people who are disabled or people of colour necessarily. But things can happen quickly. I mean, one of the things that I found as well is you may have a diverse workforce, or you may have people from different backgrounds, but they're always overlooked when, you know, do you want a columnist? Do you want a news presenter? Do you want, and you look around the office and it's almost like the people of colour become invisible. The people with the different backgrounds become invisible. It's not seen as something that they would do, whereas you'll see the sort of white Oxbridge kid as a potential for these high-profile, more responsible positions. And so take a gamble on someone who's from a younger columnist at our newspaper, and he's been one of our most brilliant columnists. So there's so much untapped potential there that, you know, I've seen that time and again. People who were seen at one point as being risky end up doing brilliantly at their job. And then the other thing, finally, I'd say you have to put in the resources. It's a thing you can do on the cheap. If you are committed to change, make sure it's properly funded, that people have the time to do the work, to find people, to make the changes, and monitor progress as well. But that's my very quick and easy 6-point plan to changing your organisation.
Thank you,
I counted
Joseph.
6.5 then.
Now, before we come to questions from the audience, Eva, now you've had a long and varied career, and Perugia attracts a lot of young journalists who may want to break into the industry. What advice do you have for young, keen journalists in navigating the industry?
That's a good. I mean, what I would say is that, you know, I think there's never been a better time to be able to get your work out there. There's so many platforms. You know, I think that I would say don't be wedded to the idea that the only places that you can write or get your journalism out there is the BBC, is the Guardian, is the Times. There are so many platforms out there. You can create your own platform. It's never been easier to reach audiences, but, you know, people still, you know, have aspirations to be on, you know, the New York Times or the Guardian. So I would say just be persistent. You know, offer news editors, features editors are always looking for new ideas, so be persistent. There's no such thing as, you know, when I was applying for jobs before I was in I've still got all those rejection letters at home, and I wrote, you know, I was writing letters when I was just finishing university to news editors saying, oh, can I get a job on the news desk? I didn't even know what the news desk was, and they must have thought it was this, you know, random person writing these questions. So for young, I would say, look, there's never been a better time. It's really easy to reach audiences. Be persistent, but, you know, it's hard work. You know, it is hard work, but, you know, if it's something that you want, really go for it, I would say.
Fabulous. So we are going to open up the conversation to the audience. What we're going to do is a show of hands for the audience. I will then repeat it for the streaming at home. And if you want to write a question for the panellists, tweet at BizK1. That's BIZK1. Let's start in the room. Does anyone have a question? And in the blue.
Hi, Stephen. My question's for Joseph. You worked for a black news organization in the UK. Can you talk a little bit about thinking about diversity in already diverse newsrooms? For example, a Palestinian-run news for Palestinians. How should they think about diversity? Like, of course, because it's not necessarily solved for them either. Do you understand my question?
So the question for those at home is, and change springing from diversity in already diverse newsrooms. Joseph?
Well, I think the answer is that whatever your organisation, there's always you will always have diversity issues. You could be, when I was at The Voice in the late 1980s, it was a very hetero male dominated organisation, and obviously that tied in with a sort of traditional, what then was sort of Caribbean culture, which sort of dominated the organisation. And so we had our diversity issues. We certainly weren't perfect. We represented black people, but there were groups within black society who we didn't represent as well. And over time, that has changed. But I think, you know, wherever you are, you know, we didn't have any people with disabilities at the organisation at the time. I just think whether there are so many issues that we have, you know, be it disability, neurodiversity, we have regional disparities as well. You know, there's a lot of difference between Northern England and the South, where the sort of power tends to lie, that we need to be conscious of too. So I think, you can never rest and say, we've done it. And you always have to be looking at including, but you always need to think, will that person coming, will those people want to work for my organisation? Will they want to apply for my organisation? And when they come here, will they enjoy the experience? And I think you need to be thinking about all manner of groups all the time to make sure that you get the answers right on that.
We have a quick question from Twitter, from Elisa. Are there policies, or have there been policies in your workplaces to hire more LGBT plus people, and how do these work in practice?
The BBC definitely monitors that. In the 24 years that I was there, they monitor that more, and they don't have explicit targets, but LGBTQ plus what's the word I'm looking for? Over-index at the BBC compared to the general population. Having said that, and that's kind of the reason that we're here, is the question is, does that then translate into the actual news and the actual product that they're producing? So, for example, and we have to go there eventually, let's talk Ukraine. You know, I can't recall seeing any stories, and I'm sure there'll be one or two, right? But I can't really recall that many stories which is looking at LGBTQ issues with regards to Ukraine and the war. And war, just like everything, affects different groups differently, you know, and so that's, for me, shows a deficit. And if the BBC, or you can, that's why you can't just look at the numbers. If you look at the numbers, the BBC's doing great on LGBTQ representation, but is it really doing great on its changing its culture and the product on the news? And I'm not only talking about the BBC due to the fact that the BBC actually, of every media organisation that I know, has the best diversity statistics literally in the world, right? It publishes everything. There are flaws which we advise them about, but they do really, compared to others, they're really good. So I think it's a really good question with regards to hit your target, but does that really change your culture?
And there's a brilliant piece in the latest Representology on starting your new queer media platforms if you're sick with coverage within the mainstream. And it's very good. It's from Jamie Wareham. So, another question from the audience. Young woman over there. So, the question for people at home is, how do people at the top sort of encourage kind of meaningful change? And Eva, because you were in management, weren't you? You at the London paper, maybe you have a suggestion.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I think that it's, what often happens is that the editors or the people at the top really do think that they may want to make the change, but often that memo doesn't filter down to the middle management. So you sort of, you know, the diktat comes from the top. We want more diversity. And then potentially when more diverse talent is brought into the organisation, they hit that middle management who haven't quite got their memo, and they're not fully on board. So they're not encouraging. They're not, these younger journalists, they're not progressing. So I think that culture and that, you know, as Joseph said, if you want that diversity, it has to be baked through and it has to run through the whole organisation. And it's incumbent upon the senior management and the editors to make sure that the people, the middle management, are on board with it and are making that change. And you're also seeing that diverse talent then progress through the organisation, not that they're staying in the same position in which they joined, so that you have to see progress in that talent. I think those things we do need to start. I think the BBC does do a very good job at monitoring these things, and I think other organisations have to start monitoring them as well. Otherwise, we're not really seeing how that change is manifested.
And just to add to that, I have an idea I call everyday inclusion. And it's I think what happens often is that even if the person at the top says, we want to change our diversity and our diversity stats, it's done, and people talk about it's your annual appraisal or whatever, and we'll look at it then. It can't be something that you do once a year. It can't be something that you only think of when you're making a recruitment decision, a recruitment choice. Every day, every manager, editor in a news organisation is making a decision about what to cover, what angle to cover it, and whose voices will be heard and who will be sent to cover the story. And it's those decisions that are made every day, every single day, which is where diversity and inclusion really happens. And so it's the kind of thing the person at the top needs to be reminding their middle managers on a regular basis. We want difference. Bring me difference. What have you done this week for difference? What have you done this month for difference? But do it at such regular intervals that it's something that the middle managers, the middle level of tier of editors will be thinking about all the time.
So I would agree with what Joseph is saying. I'd also just say it's not so much, I don't think that it's so much that the memo hasn't gone from the top to middle management. I think that the top are sending conflicting memos. And if one of your if your metrics of how your organization views success is a large audience, and you see that you are telling that your core audience, or giving the impression that your core audience is white or is a certain demographic or what have you, right? And you reward people who are able, and you reward editors who then have stories that are able to attract that audience. Sending another memo 5 minutes later saying, and we want diversity, I think the memos are getting down. I think it's a problem that there are conflicting memos. And so exactly what Joseph is saying, you need to make sure that you have consistency in what you are as an executive, as to what you're actually telling your middle management, what you want, so that the things don't seem to conflict. And you need to ensure that you reward those diverse stories, or those diverse hires, or however the culture, however your news organisation is expressing itself with regards to diversity. Don't want to. I mean, it's hard to contradict Eva or Joseph, but I think it's about conflicting memos rather than the memo not, in my experience.
So we have another conversation on Twitter. The question from Marina is, how important is personal political activism in being effective in a diversity environment? Now, I think that a lot of people of colour, certainly in the media, who have, say, spoken out against racism, have, by colleagues within their organisations, been considered activists on that very basis, which is slightly worrying. I'm hoping things are changing. So personal political activism's link with diversity.
Well, if we're talking about personal political activism, around the time of the Macpherson inquiry, as I mentioned, I got together a group of the people of colour at The Guardian, and as I say, there were about 10 of us at the time. But we together wrote a letter and demanded a meeting with our editors saying, we are unhappy with how this organisation deals with race. And if we're talking about very personal political activism, in the sense that we became a sort of internal rebel group, and we have remained so, thankfully. It's a sense that when you are talking together, united as one group, and then you take your concerns to the person at the top has to listen. It wouldn't have mattered if there were 5 of us. If it's like the only 5 people of colour, could be the only 5 people with disabilities in the organisation, or whatever. If they're all speaking with one voice and having a similar experience, which is a negative experience, in my organisation, I need to do something about it. I can't ignore them. And too often, before then, we could be picked off individually, and we could be told, well, there, dear boy, you don't really know what you're talking about. That's why we do what we do. And and one day, dear boy, you'll understand. That kind of patronising attitude, which was prevalent in the 1990s. It gets you over that. We are speaking together. Don't bullshit us. Tell us, we know what we feel and we know what we experience. And that's so in terms of that activism, and I'd say get together, however many of you there are in an organisation, get together, talk, agree what you agree on, or agree your experiences, and take it straight to the top. Demand a meeting with the person at the top, because they will have to listen.
Yeah, in terms of political activism's link with journalism, I've always found it fascinating, because I was an activist before I ever wrote anything. I think I was involved in the campaign to kick out the British National Party, a sort of far-right party in Britain, in Barking. And I learned a lot about that mentality, to a point where I would write that. So, you know, a decade ago, I wrote about Marine Le Pen. I went to visit her, and this weekend, she may, you know, she's 50-50 on being, you know, winning the votes in the French elections, you know. Or I'd write about Trump's effect on the Republican Party. But from an activist perspective, it took years to get those viewpoints that I developed as an activist into the mainstream discourse. Now everyone can agree that the far right is a thing, but at the time you were a kind of lonely activist with your ideas and a blank Word document on your computer. Anyway,
But
so...
I would just add to that.
Yeah, of
I
course.
think there's a fine line, really, and I think, as I said earlier, it's brilliant that there are so many platforms. But I think where does activism and journalism, where does one begin and where does one end? Because as a journalist, it's your job to, yes, you have your sensibilities, yes, you have the issues that you're passionate about, but as a journalist, it's your job to report impartially and tell the story. So I just wonder that, you know, I just think as an activist, how do you temper your beliefs?
I think
how do you objectively tell the story if you have one particular belief? And I think what we're seeing a lot of is in journalism now is that a lot of activists have their own platforms, which is great because they can get their voices across. But as an impartial reader, how do I know what is truth and what isn't the truth?
Absolutely, but I do think those kind of mainstream conversations change through pressure. I mean, in terms of that rise in the far right that's been taking place over the last 20 years, the dominant writers in the English language were all older white men. And the biggest driver in my research and understanding is from people of colour's perspective on being, I suppose, victims of far-right violence, and also women's perspectives, which were notably absent. What you've seen translating in electoral terms in America, in Britain, in France, is harnessing those ideas that always lay dormant. And I think it's taken years for that conversation to change.
Okay. I like it when I get back onto the same page as Eva. Right? I'm nervous about activism, and I think what we should be talking about is framing. So a really good example of that, again, I'm going to talk about Ukraine. A really good example of that is when the Kenyan ambassador to the United Nations Security Council, when he talked about Russian invasion of Ukraine, he framed it in terms of 1945 borders and post-colonial borders and how you deal with those borders. That was his framing, right? When Europeans and Americans have framed the conflict, they have framed it in terms of World War II, right? A lot of the time, right? Now, I'm not saying either framing is wrong, right? I'm not saying either framing is more correct than the other. But depending on how you frame that story, from your perspective, from your diversity, from your values, you get something different from that story. And so what I'm looking for when I'm talking about diversity is often not with regards to activism, but what is the lens which we use to view stories? And when we have a multitude of those different lenses, we actually get new things from those stories. We actually get informed in different ways. And so I'm more comfortable with that rather than thinking in terms of activism.
Can I just sort of add on Ukraine? Sorry,
Please
Marcus,
do.
you've gone there. But I think I think for any person of colour, probably anywhere in the world, the reporting and the coverage of Ukraine has been an object lesson in white privilege, and how this a conflict, which is tragic, which is appalling, but how it's been reported on compared to conflicts in countries which affect brown people. And we've seen the actual level of the interest, the generation, the humanity, the humanizing of the suffering, which is absolutely correct to do, but we see how that is so absent in coverage. If this had been a conflict in Africa, it would be, well, one tribe, they killed the other tribe. It's tribal, it's black on black violence, end of story, that's what they do. And that's how we as people of colour are reported in the mainstream media all the time. We see in Ukraine a completely different thing, where the humanity and the suffering, the individual stories are really held up, and in a way that we don't have the privilege of as people of colour.
In the final 1 minute of our conversation, I would like our panellists to give one word of advice to the cigar-smoking newspaper barons that are sitting in the audience or behind the screen. So, why does improving diversity improve your journalistic output? That's what I want to know.
Shall I start?
Each of you.
Go ahead, boss.
So, because if you are in a room with only straight, white, Oxbridgey men, you cannot tell me that you are covering the world as it is. You cannot tell me that you really know what's going on. No matter how clever those posh white boys are, they cannot understand the world as it is.
Good answer. I'm not sure I can top that, but I would say in terms of...
Neither of us can, man.
No, that's a great answer, Joseph. But, you know, you asked about why is it important to have diversity. It's all about audiences. All newspapers, all broadcasters want to reach as wide an audience as possible. And if you're only talking to one chance of the audiences, you're missing out on a whole other audience. So.
Okay, they're perfect answers. I can't top those, so I'm just going to sell, right? This is free online, right? Representology, just Google it, Representology from the Lenny Henry Centre, and that will have this is issue 3, it has multiple articles on how and why diversity is important, how it can change your newsroom, blah, 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 blah. So I'm not going to give the answer because they're too good, but I'm going to sell this, go online, check this out.
Thank you to the wonderful audience and the wonderful audience questions and the wonderful questions on Twitter. I'm Kay Biswas. Thank you, Joseph Harker, Eva Simpson, Marcus Ryder. Talk to us. Bye.
That went really well. That was great, man. Well done, Eva.
That's a bit of arguing there.
Well done, Biz. That was great.
Hello.
I'm Michelle.